Okay, let's dive right into this explainer by stepping directly into a medical mystery. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating intersection of clinical knowledge, epidemiology, and honestly, how we interpret medical data in the real world. It all starts with a clinical scenario that might sound like a simple riddle at first, but as we dig into it, it reveals some absolutely crucial truths about how we evaluate baseline danger for our patients.
So imagine this. 5 patients walk into your clinic. All 5 of them have been formally diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. You've got their charts open right in front of you, and you're tasked with figuring out which one of them is at the absolute highest risk of experiencing a stroke. You are the detective here. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. These patients, they are virtually identical in every single clinical measure you have, except for 2 specific demographic variables, their sex and their ethnicity.
Now, you might be wondering if this is just some theoretical riddle I made up. Actually, no, it's an actual published multiple-choice question designed to evaluate advanced clinical knowledge. It's pulled right out of the Continuum Medical Journal. So, this is a genuine scenario that medical professionals are asked to systematically evaluate to prove they truly understand stroke risk factors in epidemiological data.
Let's look at your options. We've got a 66-year-old Hispanic woman, a 66-year-old Native American woman, a 67-year-old white man, a 68-year-old African American woman, and a 68-year-old Asian woman. Notice how they're basically the exact same age, just a year or two apart. To really grasp the tension of this clinical riddle, you have to imagine that their blood pressures are identical. Their lipid panels match perfectly. BMI, A1C levels, exactly the same. Literally, the only differences presented to you are these written demographic categories. So given perfectly identical clinical vitals, who do you choose?
Before we reveal the historical correct answer, we kind of need to understand metabolic syndrome from first principles. It isn't just a single disease with a single pathogen. It's a cluster of risk factors, things like hypertension, insulin resistance, central obesity, that all happen together. And to really get why it's so dangerous, we have to look at the pathophysiology. Conditions like high blood sugar and elevated blood pressure literally scour and damage the delicate inner linings of your blood vessels, the endothelium. This constant microscopic damage creates this highly inflammatory state, accelerating arterial plaque buildup and setting the perfect stage for a major cardiovascular event. So how does this actually build up? Well, these individual components don't just passively add up, they actively cluster together. First, the risk factors emerge. Next, they have this massive synergistic impact on the vascular system. Think of it this way. Having one risk factor, like mild hypertension, is like carrying a heavy backpack. It's a burden for sure, but it's manageable. But when these factors cluster into metabolic syndrome, it's like lighting that heavy backpack on fire. The damage multiplies exponentially, leading directly to a significantly increased probability of a stroke. Which brings us to this absolutely crucial baseline number. Numerous prospective studies show an overall stroke hazard ratio of 1.5 for patients with this syndrome. What does that actually mean for us? It means that, across the board, simply having metabolic syndrome makes a person 1.5 times more likely to suffer a stroke compared to someone without it. It's a massive, incredibly powerful statistical multiplier that we have to take very seriously.
This grounds us in the gold standard epidemiological data, specifically the Northern Manhattan study. The medical community relies heavily on this large-scale prospective study to prove that having this cluster of conditions results in that 1.5 hazard ratio. They painstakingly tracked thousands of individuals over years to get this exact data. But keep in mind, that 1.5, that's just the overall population average.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really common trap. We absolutely have to distinguish between relative risk and absolute risk. Think of relative risk like that 1.5 multiplier, kind of like buying lottery tickets. If your relative risk doubles, it sounds huge, double the chance to win. But if your absolute risk, your actual baseline chance of winning, was only 1 in a million to begin with, doubling it to 2 in a million means the event is still incredibly rare. A multiplier is only half the story. You always have to know the absolute baseline risk of the person sitting right in front of you. Let's look a bit closer at how researchers from the Northern Manhattan study actually broke down that 1.5 average. When they unpacked the data, they found a significant effect modifier based on sex. The data clearly showed that the effect of metabolic syndrome on stroke risk is actually greater among women than men. So the syndrome amplifies the baseline stroke risk for females far more significantly than for males who have the exact same physiological markers.
But they didn't stop there. When they factored in ethnicity, they found yet another distinct effect modifier. The data showed that the effect of metabolic syndrome was notably greater among Hispanics than it was among African Americans and whites. So, statistically speaking, within the confines of this study, the risk multiplier associated with the syndrome is elevated for this specific demographic group compared to the others.
All right, let's bring it all together. Combining those two statistical insights solves our clinical riddle. We need the patient who is a woman, and we need the patient who is Hispanic. Therefore, the 66-year-old Hispanic woman is the historical correct answer based purely on that broad population data. By checking the boxes of those two demographic effect modifiers, she statistically faces the highest relative risk multiplier from the syndrome. Boom, the perfect, tidy answer to a multiple choice test.
But wait, here is the massive plot twist of this whole explainer. The source material makes it incredibly clear that this rote memorization question is actually a profound warning. It's a warning about how easily population epidemiology can be misused in real, day-to-day clinical practice. The irony is that solving this riddle highlights a deep flaw. Are we overinterpreting broad population data by blindly applying it to the unique, biologically complex individuals standing right in front of us?
We have to transition away from these old historical approaches, like fixating on demographic labels, relying on race-based risk profiling, or just memorizing stats for exams. Instead, we've got to embrace modern clinical reality. That means focusing intensely on individual patient factors and aggressively treating the specific physiological components driving the disease. Look, demographic buckets aren't physiological mechanisms, right? Treating the actual biological factors, the blood pressure, the blood sugar, the lipids, that is what actually drives better patient outcomes. So here is your ultimate takeaway. It's a clear mandate from modern practice. Treat the individual patient's specific risk components, not their demographic labels. If someone has metabolic syndrome, you need to look at their specific blood pressure, their specific lipid levels, and their unique degree of endothelial damage. You treat the living, breathing person and their highly specific disease cluster, not just the broad epidemiological bucket they happen to fall into on a spreadsheet.
Which brings us to the end of our analysis today. I want to leave you with one final, profound question to mull over. The next time you look at a compelling medical statistic or a hazard ratio, are you going to ask if it applies merely to a demographic label, or will you do the harder work of figuring out how it applies to the actual living patient sitting right in front of you?